Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts
and inspire you to do even greater things.
Before we jump into today's conversation, a special thanks to PM Power Consulting for encouraging and supporting this show right from the start. With over 1,000 person-years of collective experience, PM Power has helped many organizations, teams, and individuals chart out their own journeys of excellence and make progress. Thank you, PM Power. Now, let's move to today's episode. Today, I'm in conversation with Sophia Willows, the head of engineering at RAI, an A16Z-backed developer tool startup making APIs for online commerce. At RAI, Sophia shapes the technical direction of the company and is responsible to build a high-performance engineering culture. She's a software engineer from New Zealand, and she shares her journey into the tech industry. Initially aspiring to be an astronaut, she pivoted towards computer science due to physical limitations. And she gained early experience as a founding employee of a local startup, learning about the fast-paced nature of startups and the challenges of balancing academic commitments with work responsibilities. Sophia discusses the transition from academia to industry, highlighting the importance of strong communication and problem-solving skills. She emphasizes the need to understand the various stakeholders involved in a project, including business objectives, developer constraints, and end-user expectations. The conversation delves into the differences between building for developers and building for end users. Sophia expresses her preference for building for developers as it allows for a greater focus on code quality and technical excellence. However, she acknowledges the importance of considering the end-user experience, even indirectly. The final part of the conversation explores the challenges of creating APIs that are easy to use and understand for developers. Sophia discusses the importance of clear documentation, intuitive design, and active community engagement in ensuring a positive developer experience. Listen on. Hi, Sophia. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Hey, Shiv. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, we've not had too many guests from New Zealand, and I'm also very curious to know how things are out there. And before we get into some of those things, I thought we can start with your origin story and your career trajectory, how you got into IT and all the things that you've been doing.
Yeah, sure. For the longest time, I thought I had a very unique story about getting into IT, but I've met a number of people with the exact same story at this point, which is quite incredible. I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up.
Oh, wow.
That was my dream career. I loved space. I had this big poster on my wall as a kid. I had all these books and couldn't get enough of it. But I'm remarkably tall. People are always very surprised by this, and there are some like height requirements to be an astronaut. Like, they only make sort of the suits so large, and like the physical dimensions of the seats are only suited for people below a certain height. And it looked like I was gonna be a little too tall. So I had to figure out, what boring thing do I want to do? Nothing's ever going to be quite as cool as being an astronaut, I don't think. And so my stepdad was, sort of working with computers, not as a software engineer, but it was sort of a professional job where he was on the computer a lot. And it was back in the days when like computers didn't really run themselves. Like you had to troubleshoot a lot more than you do now. And he was a bit of a hobbyist, like he'd, build computers and install stuff and play with them. And so I got into it through him. And I decided, hey, like this is fun, and I like playing computer games, so maybe I will work with computers for a living when I get older. And it is remarkable to me, like how many people in this industry wanted to be an astronaut and then ended up becoming a software engineer when it didn't work out. Like I've met like 6 people who
Oh,
did
wow.
the same thing. So yeah, it's a common theme apparently. And so yeah, I decided to become a software engineer. Went to school, went to university. I started working full time during university. I was sort of in the right place at the right time, and I became the founding employee at a local SaaS startup. Um, Amazingly useful for accelerating my career trajectory. Like if you can be the first engineering hire at a company, you are going to learn so much. You get so much scope and responsibility so much earlier than you would at sort of a big corporation. And unfortunately, that startup wound up running out of money for a variety of different reasons, which I'm sure we're going to dig into. Um, so I had to pivot, and I ended up working at a place called Crimson Education, which is a big edtech company. Was there for a little over 2 years, still there in sort of like a part-time advisory capacity, and I was sort of managing engineering teams at Crimson. Towards the end, I was running their AI team. And today I'm working for a developer tools e-commerce startup called Rye. And I'm working as the head of engineering here. And I've been at Rye for just over 6 months now, so still reasonably fresh. And that's my villain origin story and how I got to where I am.
Yeah, wonderful. A couple of questions. When you said that even when you were studying, you got an opportunity to be part of the startup, right?
Yeah.
How was it to juggle uh, the demands or the pressures of academics and the pressures of probably shipping a product out?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I think like I'm very fortunate in the sense that like I get energized by solving technical problems. And so for me, like part of what I think makes me a good software engineer is that like I just love what I do and I want to do more and more and more of it. This isn't the case for everyone. Different people are energized by different things. And so that helped a lot. Like I would finish my schooling and work on the startup on the side, and it didn't feel like my battery was sort of continuously draining. But yeah, it's difficult because obviously big time commitment doing your uni studies, big time commitment doing anything sort of 0 to 1. I was sort of in between lectures, jumping on calls with potential investors and talking through the technical elements of our project. But part of this was also made a lot easier because this was around the time when like remote learning was starting to take off. And so I didn't need to be physically on campus. And I was working remote for the startup as well. I was sort of 1 hour away and city over. And not having to commute, not having to sort of physically be present, and having things like lecture recordings available for asynchronous review after the fact. I wouldn't have been able to do it without that being the case. So some of this is also just like, I was lucky to be doing this at a time when it was sort of easier to do. Some of the people I look up to in this industry, they were doing similar things, working and studying at the same time, like 20 years ago, when you absolutely could not get a lecture recording and you absolutely could not just jump on a Zoom meeting for work. And they had a 1,000 times worse than I did.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people found that not having to commute gives you so much more time.
Yeah.
But then in the as a student, you probably had a very well-defined curriculum and you had some timelines, and more importantly, you had either your fellow students to work with or your professors to go for any advice. Whereas in the startup, when you said you were the first hire, there were a lot of things that you had to decide or make choices. How did
Yeah.
that go?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. Like, I mean, for what it's worth, like, prior to getting this job, like, I'd also done, some internships, and I'd always been very sort of interested in programming outside of school. So I had like side projects, and I'd done, uh, uh, sort of real like practical projects at school where, for instance, I built this tool for one of our deputy principals to analyze our exam results and like produce a report at the end of the year. And so I had some pre-existing experience working with non-technical people and trying to figure out um, uh, how do you turn this very vague requirement of, oh, I want this report at the end of the year that analyzes our exam results, like go solve that for me. How do you take that and turn it into something a bit more concrete and figure out like how do I go from A to B to C? Um, so that was very helpful. I could lean on that experience. I wasn't completely thrown in at the deep end immediately. Um, but yeah, I think uh, in general, like very different environment where university is, of course, a little less structured than high school. You're kind of treated as an adult, but it is still very much like on rails. It's like, hey, this assignment is due by this date. Here's the exact specification. Like you either hit it or you don't. Whereas in startup land, oftentimes we'll say, hey, this project needs to be out by this date, and like this is what it needs to look like. Um, and as you sort of start building this thing, you learn how to build it. No planning in software is ever totally perfect up front. And so there is this big difference where, that deadline can be moved, unlike an assignment deadline, or the shape of the solution and how it ends up looking by the time you ship it can, look very different from what you had envisioned in your mind. So yeah, a lot more sort of flexibility and critical thinking on that side, because you're not, when you're building a business, when you're building software, when you're trying to solve a problem for someone, it's very, very rare that there's a well-defined rubric that you need to hit. If there was a well-defined rubric, it generally means that someone else has already come in and like solved the problem, and you're barking up the wrong tree, right? You kind of make money in this economic system for solving novel problems and creating value and doing things better than they've done before. And so, yeah, it's a big mindset shift, I think, going from formal schooling into industry, because there is this expectation that depending on where you are in your career journey, you do this more towards your later years than you do initially. You're responsible for shaping the solution rather than delivering something well defined. And I think it's a big sort of mindset shift for everybody entering industry. Like I've seen a lot of junior engineers on my team really struggle with this.
Yeah.
And
Have there been any techniques or practices that have helped you with this shift?
That's a good question. Like it's can I think of a particular technique that has helped me? I think like it really comes like I think a big part of this comes down to having really great soft skills and being a great sort of communicator. Because again, like in university, you're doing an assignment, you have a very well-defined specification. Oftentimes, this thing's being recycled from one year to the next. So it's like, this is the 10th time the lecturers run this project. They know all the edge cases. They've all been described on the specification. Like it's rock solid, right? In industry, that's never the case. And I honestly like very rarely ever had to ask questions of my lecturers and professors in university because everything was so well defined and sort of buttery smooth. In industry, that's not the case. You need to be able to talk to people. You need to be able to understand them, speak their language, translate what they're saying into technical requirements. And so I think like something that anybody can do to sort of level up here is two things. Like one is you should get really good at verbal communication, like speaking in a group and things like this. I have some friends who went to things like Toastmasters, which is like this sort of public speaking group. And the other thing that I really recommend and has been very useful for me is like getting into the habit of writing things down. I think verbal communication lets you hide a lot of sloppiness in your thinking. You can sort of do what I just did right now and say, oh, thought of, or things like this, and people fill in the blanks. Putting things down onto paper really forces you to think through the thing you're trying to talk about and discover and shape. And any sloppiness in your thinking is going to be very immediately apparent. And a useful tool for me has been when I'm working on a project, I will try to write down, okay, what is my plan of attack? What am I thinking about for this project? What is it going to look like? What do I need to do technically? If there's anything I'm uncertain about, that will always come through in my writing. I'll always find, oh, this paragraph that I'm trying to write is really hard. I don't understand this very well. And that's a good sort of signal for me to go talk to someone, a product manager or a customer or someone else on the engineering team, and try to get some more clarity and brainstorm this out and think it through. So I think getting really good at written communication and getting into this habit of writing a lot has been really helpful for me. And just generally, sort of the backdrop to that is also just being able to talk to people and do that efficiently.
On the point of understanding, I want to go a little deeper. Because when you're trying to say, solve a problem for someone, you need to also understand the domain. What are probably some good practices in the domain, etc. And then it is also about the organization, how they want to do things or what they do not want to do, etc. And then, of course, it's about the individual users who want to achieve something. How do you kind of synthesize all these things and probably arrive at a, I guess, compromise, so to say, and tell them, yeah, this is something that's going to work for you?
Yeah, totally. This is sort of I think every single place I've worked at, like this has been a recurring challenge. Like at Rye, for instance, we have business goals when we're building this e-commerce API that we sort of want to prioritize and that we think are important or opinionated. And then we have developers at other companies integrating with our API, and they have sort of business objectives that they're looking to achieve and enable with our API. And then there's this third stakeholder, which is, okay, the developers built an app on top of our API, and now two steps removed from us is someone, regular everyday consumer using this application that uses our API. And they also have sort of expectations around the final user experience and mode of interaction. And a lot of that responsibility in our case is up to the developer building the app. But they're also technically constrained by some of the design decisions that we've made in our API. If our API just fundamentally doesn't support a particular use case, then the developer is not going to be able to implement that because we don't support it as sort of the underlying technical platform. And so, in Rye's case, it's very well defined. We have these three parties, but there's also, as you mentioned, organizational constraints. So, for instance, one of the products that I worked on is this thing called Advent Yogi Essays. It's this AI-powered essay review tool. And I'm not an essay review expert, but at Crimson we had essay review experts who were the sort of human manual team for doing essay review. And there were some political challenges getting these guys to help us build this tool because they looked at this AI essay reviewer and thought, hey, if I help Sophia and her team build this thing, like what happens to me when there's this AI that can
Yeah.
review essays, right? Which is a very valid concern. So I don't have sort of like a generally applicable pattern for dealing with this because it is so contextual to the specific business that you're working in. At Rye, like we generally have a bias towards prioritizing the developer in all of our decisions because there's this background context of we're early stage, we're trying to grow our customer base, our developers are our direct customers. It's not sort of mission one to be prioritizing like our internal business needs because we have a ton of funding and runway is very healthy. So we can prioritize developer concerns and try to activate more customers. In other cases, like my first job at this local SaaS company in New Zealand, like we didn't have as healthy of a runway, and we were doing this sort of B2B to C model where similar to Rye in some senses, but the businesses we were selling to weren't as sort of technically sophisticated. We were selling to tradespeople in New Zealand who sort of got a website through us and shipped that to customers looking for like tiling jobs. That user experience is really important because if people don't like how that website looks, how sort of the widgets we built looks, like the tradesperson we're selling to gets zero value whatsoever. And so their concerns are actually slightly less important probably than the end customer. So I think if I had to give like some generally applicable tool here, it would be it's really important to understand where your business is at. Like, is it mission critical to be making revenue? Is it mission critical to be activating customers? If revenue is important, then probably your internal business objectives are more important. If getting customers is important, then you should be prioritizing customers, generally speaking. And the other thing is to understand your value chain, right? So if you could pick, zero internal business objectives, zero sort of customer objectives, which one's more disastrous for your business? So at Quotamation, this trades people B2B to C fast. Like if there are no end customers using these websites, like our business is worth nothing. So that was sort of the most important thing, and it all comes down to like the value chain, like where does this sort of flywheel of success hinge on?
So what do you find either more challenging or more satisfying, building for developers or building for business users?
I really love building for developers. This is like
Okay.
a lifelong passion of mine. So like most of my work experience has been building either consumer apps or building B2B apps. And what we're building is like, we're building a web application. It has a UI and it achieves some objective for a consumer or business on the other end of the UI. So at Crimson, we were building a technology platform for managing all of our students' data, and we built some AI tools for recommending things like extracurricular activities or summarizing meeting notes. And there's a student on the other end that's using this thing. And what happens in environments like this, and this is what most software engineers, the environment they're familiar with, things like the quality of your code base and sort of your internal engineering excellence, these things feel very important to us as engineers because we're working with the code on a day-to-day basis. But the person on the other end of the product that's using the UI really could not care less so long as the product is doing what they need it to do. And so the incentives here, if you are sort of a business person or an engineering manager, or product manager, is you're always going to have like this bias towards, or you'll naturally have this bias towards pushing out new features and like polishing the UI and all of these things because this is what customers are buying. And if customer and you need people to buy your software because at the end of the day, like that's what puts food on the table. And as an engineer working in this environment, it can be a little disheartening because you see all these things that are wrong, all the spaghetti code and technical debt and things that don't feel so good. And it can be hard to get buy-in on these things. When you build for developers, it's a little different. So at Fry, like we don't ship a UI. We're not shipping a concrete actualized product. People aren't buying us to, because they can sign in and file a tax return really efficiently. People are buying us because we give them an API that enables them to go on and build an amazing experience for an end shopper. And what's different here is the quality of our code base really, really matters because we're not shipping a UI. Like we are shipping our software interface to developers. And so if we feel like our software isn't very high quality, the developer on the other end of the equation is also going to feel this. And if it's hard to integrate with our API, like we're just not going to have any customers. So if you're building a banking application, like you bring in user experience experts to tell you, okay, this is how you build your sign-up form so that grandma can, figure it out and succeed on her own. When you're building software for developers, when you're shipping APIs, like you bring in developer experience experts who know, okay, this is how you build a nice, ergonomic, easy-to-use API that people can integrate with nicely. Here are all the best practices around documentation. These are the things you want to avoid when building your system, like this is how to manage technical debt. These things are much more important, relatively speaking, because people aren't interacting with us through a UI that can hide this underlying sort of nastiness or complexity. People are integrating directly with the code interfaces that we're shipping. So personally, I really like this because we get to be very sort of focused on quality, and I'm a big believer in quality. And the incentives just generally feel a lot better building for developers rather than end consumers. One thing I'll note here is like obviously there's a bit of a caveat that like we still ultimately need to be thinking about that end consumer because indirectly we're responsible for that experience. Like there's no job on earth or very few jobs on earth where you get to 100% focus on code and like never care about anything else. That's always still in background, and like there is definitely pressure for us to release new features so that developers can in turn build experience for their customers. So we still have technical debt. We still make these sort of trade-offs. We're just a lot more, I would say, like intentional and thoughtful about it than we might be if we were the ones directly building those consumer apps.
Yeah, you kind of preempted a question that crossed my mind, which is when you are developing APIs and then you're creating solutions for developers, you are part of the ecosystem, but you're probably somewhere in between. But the user experience would be largely influenced by the last mile. Even if there are UX experts who are saying how, say, login should happen or how transaction should happen, the understanding of the developers to use your APIs, plus many times developers may not be using only one set of APIs. And some of these from different publishers could follow slightly different, say, models. Yeah. Whether it is in terms of error logging or in terms of how you can do things and all that. So how do you enable your customers as the developer community to understand your APIs better and leverage or get the maximum benefit out of that? I asked Sophia about how they enable their customers as the developer community to understand the APIs better and leverage or get the maximum benefit out of that. The answer to this question and a lot more interesting details in the second part of the episode. Don't miss it.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.